Are you curious about BC and Ontario wine regions and wine styles? What are some top tips to get to get the most from your visit to these regions? And which challenges do the BC and Ontario wine regions face in the future? Well, tonight you're going to get all of those tips and stories and more. If you're watching this video on the replay, please, in the comments, type the word replay. Let me know where you're logging in from. And I don't know, what's the weather like? What's in your glass? And of course, if you're here with me live, I want to hear from you as well. I'm Natalie McLean, and I teach popular online wine and food pairing courses, and you've just joined the most passionate group of wine lovers who meet on the internet every Wednesday at 7 p.m. on Facebook Live and YouTube live stream to talk to the most interesting people in the world of wine, like our guest, whom I'll introduce in a moment. Now, I'm live streaming this for the first time, but it is a recording based on an interview I had with our guest for my podcast, Unreserved Wine Talk. However, I am here live in the comments, so get in there. Let me know what stories and tips you're enjoying, what questions you still have, and I'll be responding, as they say, in real time. All right, now before I introduce Luke, just let me say that three of you are going to win personally signed copies of his terrific new book, The Sipster's Guide to the 50 Must-Try Ontario Wines. It's hot off the presses. It's in such a great, convenient shape that it's perfect, if I may say, as a stocking stuffer to give as a gift or to give yourself. All right, back to our guest. Luke Whittall has worked in cellars, vineyards, and in wine shops since 2005. He has authored or co-authored 5 books on wine. His first book, Valleys of Wine, A Taste of British Columbia's Wine History, was published in 2019. Then in 2020, he co-authored the 6th edition of the Okanagan Wine Tour Guide with John Schreiner, arguably one of Canada's best wine writers. Luke's latest series of books, The Sipster's Pocket Guide, features some of the best must-try wines produced in BC and Ontario. Luke is also the host and producer of the Sipster's Wine Podcast, and he joins us now from his home in the beautiful Okanagan Falls. Welcome, Luke. It's so great to have you here with us.
Hi, Natalie. Thank you for having me. This is fantastic.
Oh, my pleasure. We're just going to pick up the conversation because, of course, last time we were talking on your podcast, you were interviewing me. So I am relishing the chance to turn the tables because you've done so many great articles and podcast episodes and writing on both BC and Ontario. Okay, so let's talk about first the inspiration for your first book, Valleys of the Wine. Where did you get the idea to write that book?
I got the idea from a slightly drunk guy at a winery that I worked at the time. It was
really?
You get inspiration where you can, I guess, is how that's supposed to go. But basically, when I talked about a wine that I thought had some history to it, and so to introduce it, I would sort of say, when they write the book about the wine industry in BC or the history, they'll talk about the Soyez La Rose, and they'll talk about all these other wines, and then they'll mention this wine, and then I kept going through the tasting, and to his credit, he let me finish what I was saying. But at the end of the conversation, once I'd finished, he kind of rears back in his chair a little bit, and he says, "Well, why don't you just write the book?" And it just had never occurred to me that I would do that. Writing was never on my sort of to-do list and bucket list of life or anything. It was just sort of something that kind of happened, and so I went home from that day.
We're getting a lot of static. Sorry, Luke. I'm getting you're cutting out with a lot of static right now. So I'm not hearing your answer. I don't know if there's any adjustment you can make with your speaker on your headphones or if you actually want to try that other mic.
Maybe headphones.
Okay.
Wired headphones.
Yeah, no
If
worries.
that works. That story always, is that better?
Yeah, that's much better. Thank you.
Oh, there we go. Okay. That story always gets interrupted somehow. it, I did
It's the
that on.
ghost of that guy.
I think so. It's just so weird. That sounds better though, I guess, doesn't it? It
It
looks a little bit
does.
weird, but okay. So what was the last thing you heard then? It was the drunk guy,
Okay, so he
probably.
leaned back in his chair and he said, "Why don't you write the book?" And you
Yeah.
said that was never on your agenda, but what
Yep.
proceed
So
from there?
basically, yeah, I went home from that experience just, full of ideas. And I went home and I wrote out a whole chapter sequence and just kind of the idea just never left me. And then I ended up talking about it to a friend of mine and then to an editor for a newspaper that I worked for at the time, who then referred to me to a book distributor, who then referred to me to the people at Whitecap Books.
Oh wow, great
And
publisher on the West Coast. Yeah.
yeah. So I mean, and that was honestly on my list of public. I mean, I have tons of books from Whitecap Books on my shelf, and so I
Hmm.
was like, this is fantastic. I couldn't even believe that was happening, but it did, and it happened within 5 years, and which in the publishing world is like really fast for a
Yeah,
book.
that's warp speed there.
Yeah, no kidding. So
And
yeah,
then
that's
let's
basically how it started.
Okay, cool. Let's talk about your next book. Just a little bit of history gathering here before we dive into the meat of the conversation. John Schreiner, fabulous writer based in BC, picked you to help him write the sixth edition of the Okanagan Wine Tour Guide. How did that happen, or why did he pick you?
I still have no idea. I really don't. That
You're
was
being
just
modest.
like that. Well, John, I've known John for about 15 years or so, just off, on and off. And I interviewed him for my first podcast that I used to do years ago, and we really hit it off. And then I realized part of the thing I realized was when we were having lunch one day at a restaurant in Penticton, and we were just talking, and I looked down, and the waitress was standing over us, tapping her shoe, going, "Are you guys going to order or anything or what? Because we've been here for an hour." And what I realized is that John and I we just talk, and we just enjoy talking about wine. We're just the most gossipy little, people kind of when it comes to the wine industry, and I think he really appreciated that part of it, and we just had a really good rapport together, and it was
Ah,
unbelievable experience to work with him, just to know how he does his research and how he goes through the writing process, because I got to see that from behind the scenes. It was really cool, and he's
oh,
so
that's
fantastic, and it scares the crap out of me that I would possibly be able to take over for him to do another wine tour guide after that, because I just can't imagine that amount of work. It's just
huh.
amazing what he does. Yeah.
It is. He's such a credit to the industry. But yes, it looks like you the heir apparent for when that time comes. Um, so what happened? You worked as a tour guide in the Okanagan for a year. Tell us about how groups connected with the winery through their stories. If you have a specific example, that would be great.
Yeah, I did work as a tour guide. I worked in retail for a long time, but decided to take a year off from that because I just didn't want to explain to someone why Chardonnay wasn't going to kill them if they drank it. And so,
Well, that's
uh,
news.
no, at the time, the ABC Club was running strong.
Right.
The
Anything but
so
Chardonnay. Mm.
yeah, and so I didn't quite understand that because there's some beautiful Chardonnays here. Anyway, so I was taking a group around to a winery, and the winery, which I won't name, had kind of a nebulous story, and it wasn't really. I could tell it wasn't really connecting, and I'd made sure, like I knew the person who was managing the winery. I made sure that they got a really good experience, all that kind of stuff,
Hmm.
and I could tell it just wasn't grabbing. And then when I got back on the bus afterwards with this group, I asked them, what did you think? And they said, you know, what does the name mean? And I was never going to tell the winery story. That wasn't my job. My job was to kind of tell them about the region and things like that. But I kind of explained what their name sort of meant, and they kind of leaned back and they said, well, is that does that mean it's just a bunch of rich people trying to have a winery that has a cute name and some things around? And I said, well, that's an interesting observation. I wasn't going to lead them into anything. And it occurred to me then that the story of the winery and the connection to that story is really, really important for a winery, not just for their marketing. I mean, you can say one thing, but if you don't mean it and the story isn't authentic or isn't true, because there's some of those as well, that it just won't hit with people, and people will see through that. And
Mm-hmm.
this winery did, and 2 years later they were sold off, and
Oh,
so you know what I mean. And they're still in business, but it's
get your story straight or you'll be out of
yeah,
business. But I get your point,
yeah,
Luke. Like, because wine is a story. It's a story of place and people and time, everything that goes into making wine. And it's not just another consumer product like cornflakes or whatever. There is
no.
something there beyond just, the mass production of a certain consumable. So I wholeheartedly support your point on that.
And I think it's really important for that. You can't learn about a wine. Excuse me. You can't learn about a wine without sort of understanding, or at least having. It gives you the opportunity to, if you want to explore it, and not everybody does, and I get that. But it gives you the opportunity to learn about a region. It gives you the opportunity to learn about a place. You can't taste wines from Virginia without learning about all of the earliest people who tried to grow grapes there, and that kind of thing. Like you can't go through California without learning about the Spanish missionaries, and it's just kind of part of the I think part of the fun, part of the appeal.
Absolutely. The way wine connects with so much history, culture, commerce, everything. All right, let's dive into these wine regions. So, although your latest book is The Sipster's Pocket Guide to 50 Must Try Ontario Wines, which is fabulous. There's the picture. There, okay, for those of you who are listening to the podcast, what a great cover. I love it.
Thank you. Very
There's the
different from the
set.
BC one, yeah.
Yeah, and I'm going to ask you about the differences, but I really like
Sure.
that they're good covers,
hmm
catchy, and as I say, fits perfectly in a Christmas stocking. Um, so yes, there you go.
I don't have a stocking with me, sir.
No, you do a demo, I'm sure, if you did. So your previous books focus on British Columbia's wine regions. So for those of us who are not as familiar with these areas as you are, you're living it, you're right there.
Yeah.
Give us an overview of BC as pertains to wine. How many wineries are in the province?
That depends on the day, it seems
Sure.
like. Every time I hear a stat, it tends to change. And but right now, throughout the province, there's probably about 330 to 350 or so licenses.
Wow.
It's quite a large number. Now, not a lot of them are very large. Some of them are quite
Sure.
small, and they're not all in the Okanagan. There's a growing industry on Vancouver Island and
Yeah.
in the Fraser Valley and in the Kootenays, there's and Kamloops. There's more regions than just the Okanagan now.
Sure.
But
And we're going to
most
talk
people
about
think of
those.
that.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
most
And
people think about the Okanagan though.
and how does that compare to Ontario number of wineries? Now I know the production is vastly different and there are going to be a lot of small wineries in BC. There are also a lot of small wineries in Ontario, but so we've got 300, 350 in BC. Ontario, how many roughly?
I think it's around 180, 190. It's less wineries, but they're
Oh,
much bigger.
they're much bigger. Okay.
Yeah, they tend to be
Wow.
they tend to be more like more acreage. The minimum acreages are
Okay.
bigger. There's just more land,
In Ontario or in
Yeah, I mean,
BC?
in
Ontario.
Ontario, yeah,
Right.
in BC we run out of land. It just ends up you get too high up the mountain and there's nothing left, and it's
Huh.
completely inhospitable to growing grapes of any kind. So we really only have the valley bottoms to be able to do that. That's why my first book was called Valleys of Wine, because everything
Right.
is in a valley somewhere.
And is that
So
because it's a protected area climatically? They have to plant the grapes there? Is it just too cold to go on to the mountainsides or
yeah, yeah. I mean, I used to be able to see Mount Baldy from my house in Oliver when I lived there, and there was snow there until the end of June, and there was snow there again at the beginning of July. So, and,
oh
because it
wow.
was it was at 5,000 feet or so. So it
Huh.
was there's a lot of that around. The difference really is that there isn't also a lot of soil. I used to work at a winery that backed up against Mount Kobo on the Golden Mile, and I get asked. I had a German tour group with me, and they were asking why we didn't plant farther up the mountain, and I said, well, it's too steep. Not thinking that, of course, in Germany, steep has no relevance. I mean, they're harvesting on vineyards that are 45 degrees.
Yes.
So they said, well, that's not steep. And I'm like, but there's also no soil.
So what
And
is it? Just
you
pure
know,
rock? Is it? Just no
it's basically,
topsoil?
yeah, there's very little topsoil. There's very little anything, in terms of that. There are pockets and stuff, but certainly not enough to make it commercially viable for growing, grapes of any kind. Some people are trying. Row 13 has a vineyard that was up high, and of course, Culmina has a vineyard that's quite high elevation as well. They've kind of tabletopped a beautiful high level vineyard. I mean, it's really up there. It's
How high is it?
beautiful. I don't know the elevation figures, but it's way above their main property, and it's a
Okay.
terrifying drive to get up to it. It really is. But
Really?
it's
Yeah.
it's just a spectacular place, and they grow Gruner Veltliner and Riesling, I think, up there. The
Oh,
old
right.
reds
All
of
those
it.
cool climate grapes. Yeah, they
Yeah,
would have to at that elevation.
yeah.
How many wineries would you estimate have opened in BC in the last, say, 5 years?
Yeah, there's a bit of a debate going on about that. The pace has sort of slowed down a little bit, I've noticed.
Why is that?
Economic factors I think are a big thing, and then
Okay.
recently the last 3 years have been really tough for climate reasons and fires and landslides, and it's just been a very very slower. The growth has slowed a little bit. There's also like I said, we're running out of land. There's not a lot
Mm.
of we can't expand very much in terms of land. Uh, so it could be that the pace is slowed. It still seems to be that there's 20 new wineries a year, but that's just anecdotal. I don't know exactly the
Sure.
figures for that. But
Right.
every time I drive down Narramata Bench Road, there's like, that's a new sign I haven't seen before. Who is that? And so
Yeah.
there's a few things like that happening every now and then. Yeah, absolutely.
So BC can't go more north. Like you hear about climate change, everything's warming up, so they can't even go more northerly, like from where the existing valleys are now, and plant and in I don't know other valleys. I'm not as familiar with the geography of BC, but that's not possible yet.
Well, it is, and I think that's sort of what's happening. There's a winery called Friend, and that they're based in West Kelowna, but they've bought a huge plot of land in Vernon, which is sort of at the top of the lake. If you imagine the lake Okanagan going, or the Okanagan Valley in BC going from Osoyoos to Vernon, with the lake actually stopping in Penticton. Vernon is at the very top, and traditionally there hasn't really been any large amount of grapes grown there at all. So he's planted huge acreage of Cabernet Sauvignon there, which is
Wow.
astonishing.
Yeah,
Yeah,
because
and
that needs lots of warmth to ripen Cabernet.
oh my God, yeah. So it's definitely going to be. I'm really curious to see what's going to happen with it. But he's very confident with the possibility of it working, and he's got it is a beautiful south-facing slope. I mean, if there's any land up there that has the potential, that's the land to do it.
Right.
So I'm very interested to see what's going to happen. Of course, we're not going to know anything about it for a few years now, but it's really really interesting to see that they can do that. There's land farther up from that, Armstrong and Enderby even into Salmon Arm, which there's also vineyards already there on the Shuswap, but they can't grow the same kind of grapes, and so we either have to start getting used to different kinds of grapes and different styles of wine, and having that really become the style for BC wine, or we wait for climate change to kind of kick in a little bit more, basically, and see what happens. And climate change, it should be noted, isn't just that it's getting hotter. It's just that the seasons are changing, winters are getting weird.
Yeah.
Things, stuff is happening. Water retention capability of the hills is lower. Forest fires wipe out huge swathes of trees, and so the land doesn't hold the water like it used to. So then we get flooding events in the spring. Like there's all kinds of other things
Yeah, it's
that
all
kind of.
tied together. And you said, yeah, the landslides are probably part of that as well because there's fewer trees holding.
Exactly, yeah. The roots that you normally hold a lot of the land together aren't there anymore, or they're dead. So there's a lot of change happening, and it's going on really noticeably year to year now, which is scary and interesting at the same time.
I was going to ask you about the wildfires a little later on, but let's dive into it because you brought it up.
Sure.
So, how were the wildfires this year compared to previous years? It seems like BC has had an issue with wildfires every year for the past, I don't know, 5 years, maybe more. What's
Yeah,
happening now?
it's been bad. This past year was pretty bad. The fire in West Kelowna was just devastating and hot and viciously. I mean, it spread across the lake, which you have to imagine, burning embers being blown more than 2 kilometers in the
Across a
air
lake. Wow.
across a lake, and I've never seen that happen before. I mean, I've been here since 2007,
Yeah.
and normally a lake or even a highway is usually pretty good stopping point, but most of the time, but for this one to cross a lake like that was just astonishing. A Soyuz had a fire earlier in the summer, which impacted a friend of mine who actually lived quite close to there. He was evacuated. There was another fire just about 5 kilometers to the west of me here that never really was threatening. I've certainly had fires personally closer to me than that, but that was close as well. So we were getting a lot of smoke, and depending on which way the wind blows, then we'd have more smoke or less smoke, and the smoke was the biggest impact for most of the daily lives of people that are here at that time when there's a lot of fire.
And are they anticipating smoke taint is going to affect the taste of the wine, this vintage? Like, because it does sort of settle on the grapes and they are osmotic. So are they
Yeah.
are they worried about that?
I think there's always a bit of concern about it. I think it's not always easy to judge based on location, and there's so many variables on it that it doesn't really. It's so hard to predict it so early on. The only
Right.
way to know really it for sure is when the wine is in the bottle and
Yes.
you're tasting it. And
Yeah.
even then, apparently, there's variations. So for some people, they'll get it more than others. Some bottles are different from bottle to bottle. I mean, smoke taint is scary for wineries for a reason, because of the potential for it being I mean, glass to glass. It's a volatile chemical that will either break down or it won't. And if it doesn't break down literally in your mouth, you won't get it. But then the person next to you that you just poured their glass, it might break down in their mouth, and then
Oh,
they get
wow.
it. And it's just crazy, Yeah. So it's a very, very, very weird and I'm trying to think of the word for kind of slithers or meanders
Idiopathic. It's not.
through.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's not predictable. Unpredictable. But is it whether the compounds break down or not in your mouth? Do you know if they're unhealthy, or is it just it's not anything to
Yeah.
do with health? It just taste. It just impacts taste.
Yeah, I don't, I'm not a scientist, so I don't know
Okay.
if what the health
Just
what the
curious.
health benefits or
Yeah.
not are, or
Sure.
I think it just comes down to sort of an unpleasantness.
Yeah.
And I've
Probably like other
tasted.
wine faults. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. But what is scary is that like cork taint is bottle to bottle, but the whole bottle is ruined, and for the most part, it's obviously ruined, right? Unless it's in just
Right.
sort of a small amount. Brett is the same thing. Some people have
Brettanomyces. Yeah.
a tolerance to it in some
That
wines, like
barnyard
in
smell. Yeah.
yeah, and in Burgundy, of course, that's perfectly normal to have a little bit of it. So it's
Sure.
not really that big a deal. But for smoke taint, it's just so wildly unpredictable, and it's when it's bad, like it's undrinkable. I've tasted smoke tainted wine that was never released, and it was like drinking out of an ashtray. I mean,
Ugh.
it was awful.
Right. And that's unfortunate for the wineries because it affects their brand. For those who don't know that this might be
Yeah.
smoke taint, like any other fault, but even more wildly unpredictable in this case, somebody could just say, geez, I don't like their style of wine, where it's actually the smoke taint, and then they never go back to the wine, which is kind
Yeah.
of unfortunate.
It
Yeah.
is, and there's some people I find there's always some people who actually kind of like it, which is
Oh,
really interesting. They like that, and I should point out that having a wine taste smoky is not the same thing as smoke taint. There's lots of, we get a nice, Syrah that has a nice sort of campfirey edge to it, or a bit
sure.
of a smoky flavor to it. That's from the barrels. That's not from smoke taint. When you actually taste smoke taint, it's not going to taste smoky. It's going to taste ashy. I find it.
Yeah.
There's a
Ashtray doesn't
yeah,
sound, yeah, more acrid as well, I would
yeah.
imagine. Okay, so in the province, BC, roughly how many bottles does it produce a year? Again, let's just keep the comparison going with Ontario since you've got books on both. But bottles to bottles, dollar to dollar. I know it varies, but on average, how much does BC produce versus Ontario?
Oh, for production levels, that can vary so much. I don't really know the actual case figures or bottle figures for the region. I know that we have about 10 to 11,000 acres of grapevines in the Okanagan right now, as
And
opposed
how's
to
that compared to
Ontario.
Ontario? Yeah.
Yeah, they had 17 to 18,000 acres. So the
Okay.
Ontario industry is a lot bigger. But again, that can translate to wildly different bottling, like bottle amounts and case amounts, just based on production levels. Some wineries or vineyards will be able to produce beautiful wines at 5 to 6 tons an acre. Syrah and Gewürztraminer varieties like that will grow quite a bit, quite happily, and make beautiful wine from it. But sometimes, like Pinot Noir, you really only want 2 tons an acre, 3 tons maybe, and
Right.
so it's kind of like it's so variable, and I think it really depends on the year as well. So by vineyard acreage, yeah, it's about 10,000, 11,000 to about 18,000. The Ontario industry is much bigger, which is part of my desire to kind of explore it because I really wanted to know what was happening there.
Sure.
And it
And
felt
you've
weird to be on this side of the same country and not be able to kind of to get, Ontario wines out here to
Oh
the same
yeah,
degree.
the
So,
cross-border shipping. I'm talking provincial borders, interprovincial borders are
yeah,
nuts. It's
yeah,
easier for us to get California wines than BC wines. In terms of our selection, California is vastly wider.
yeah.
And I mean, we could go down a rabbit hole with that, and we
Yes.
won't. But, wine is the most highest value add agricultural product that we produce in this country. Tens of thousands of jobs, all mostly rural. And still the provinces prevent easy cross-border shipping. So anyway, uh, that's a whole other podcast.
We
But
could do a whole podcast on that. Yeah, absolutely.
absolutely, and we should.
Yeah, I think so too. Yeah.
So does BC? I've heard varying figures, but what's your notion? Does BC produce roughly 10% of Canadian wine, Ontario 85, and then you've got a little bit in Quebec, a little bit in Nova Scotia, and then you've got other fruit-based wineries in the rest of the provinces, meaning not grapes, but berries and that sort of thing. What's your understanding?
10% seems a bit low. If we're
Oh,
talking about sort of grape like wine production and everything, certainly the wineries in Ontario, especially the commercial wineries like Andrew Peller, they have the production capacity that's much larger there, but that's not necessarily including the grapes and the wine that is actually grown here. So if we talk about wines that are grown here,
mm-hmm.
not imported juice and the sort of IDB type wines, the international domestic blend type wines, which Ontario does much more of than British Columbia does. So the production is higher there, but it's if we just go with the grapes that are grown and produced here, then yes, I think BC would probably have a little bit more on par with the difference in acreage, so 10,000 acres to 17,000 acres. So I could see it being more 35-40% of total production.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah, I mean
That's
the other
surprising.
industries like Nova Scotia, they don't have a huge industry there, although it is
Right.
growing and it's quite exciting, which is fantastically interesting. But the
Yeah.
volumes are very low. Same with
Yeah, they're
Quebec,
very
the
small.
volumes are very, very small. So
Yep.
yeah, so that's kind of thing. But again, I don't have those. I haven't been to the Stats Canada website lately. I did that. I did used to do that for the research for my first book. I did go through all of the annual reports for the
Mm-hmm.
liquor distribution branch in BC. I went
Mm-hmm.
through all those stats. I went
Mm-hmm.
through it's like for every single report from 1923. Like I was that kind of
Good Lord.
research guy for that. Oh, I know.
Okay.
I was not fun at parties at that point. Because
What about 1944? Gotcha.
well, the I mean,
Yeah, the
and then I would
rains.
see these statistics, and there's some really weird things that showed up in those stats, which I thought was really interesting.
Like
Like,
what?
well, on the outside of World War II, the what they used to have a category in the BCLDB, or what was the BCLDB, but the government liquor
BC
stores.
liquor stores. Yeah.
Yeah, they had a stat on what they called Oriental liquors, which was sake and all kinds of things. But as soon as World War II started, that which went up to like 12% of their total revenue. So it wasn't nothing. It was a very significant amount. But as soon as World War II happened, that plummeted to like 0.2% of total revenue. So you could see, because I mean, obviously, Japan was in the war and stuff like that, and so import, shipping got messed up during that time and things like that. So it was a real change that you could see in the stats very quickly, and it never recovered. It never really came up either after that. So stuff like that, which had nothing to do with anything that I was writing about, but I just found a tangent, and I thought, wow, that's kind of fun.
All right, you and your crackers in the corner there. Okay. So there are 9 wine-producing regions in BC, the largest and most famous of which is the Okanagan Valley, which itself has another 11 sub-regions.
It does.
So what percentage roughly of BC wine does the Okanagan Valley produce? Is it 90% or?
Yeah, it's pretty high. This is where most of the wine is made. If you were to have British Columbia wine or find it in a store, which you can find in the LCBO, wines from British Columbia there, they're going to be from the Okanagan for the most part. The wineries in other regions are very small. The production is very low. That doesn't mean it's not good. Some of it's fantastic. But even within the Okanagan, the wineries will blend across various subregions. So they'll take fruit from the Golden Mile Bench. They'll take fruit from Black Sage Bench. They'll take fruit from wherever. And that goes into what, would be VQA Okanagan.
Sure.
And I think most people kind of stick with that because Okanagan right now has that sort of name recognition that Skaha Bench doesn't have yet, or Okanagan Falls doesn't have yet, or Naramata. Naramata would be the exception. I think Naramata has done a pretty good job with their brand recognition. I think a lot of people have at least heard that name over the years, but most of them will use Okanagan still.
Okay, so I've heard that BC is a cool climate like the rest of Canada's regions. Yet it also has the last, I don't know if it's the 30 miles of the Sonoran Desert. How do those things go together? Is BC warm, cool, a mix, or overall, though, isn't it still classified as a cool climate despite the fact it's got desert in it?
Yeah, and it's hot desert too. I mean, we got up during the heat dome, we got up to 48 degrees here. So we can certainly get very, very warm. Yeah, that was a crazy time. It was bizarre. Were
there vineyards in there? In that heat dome? Okay.
Yeah, the whole province was in that heat dome at that point. It was very weird. The thing with sorry, where was I going with this? I kind of got heat domed.
Cool climate and
cool climate, right?
Cool climate versus desert.
Yeah, so technically we are still cool climate, but it's not that it's not because of the average sort of temperature. If you average out the temperatures, yes, it is still technically a cool climate because what happens is the shoulder seasons are very compressed. So our growing time when it's very warm is actually relatively short. So we have can be very cool winters, and then it will warm up. It used to be anyways. Now this is all last 5-year climate change kind of thing, but typically it will be a bit of a late start to, like, our last frost is actually quite late, and our earliest frost can be potentially quite early. So our growing season just in total is very short compared to places like California where they don't get as cold in the winter. The growing season starts far earlier, and it's a slower start, so the temperature comes up a little bit slower. It does get as hot, but then the denouement of the growing season is it doesn't have a hard stop to it, so it's a much slower. So there's much more time to kind of do everything, and so I think that's really the reason is the short compression of our season.
Okay, now I understand it, because I thought, how do those things go together? Okay, so tell us a few things.
Yeah, it's true.
Tell
it's
us
confusing.
a few things that would surprise us about the Okanagan region. Things that we might not know, fun facts, things we could drop at our next dinner party.
Things that will win you a bet if you bring it up in conversation.
Oh, I like those. Yes.
Yeah, those are fun too. Things about the Okanagan. Well, if you want a little factoid about just the lake itself, maybe not just about wine, but it takes approximately 60 years for every single drop of water in Lake Okanagan to change out, to basically cycle through. So they call it a
And where's it
refresh
cycling
rate.
through to?
Well, it's just draining down. Eventually it'll all end up in Portland, but you know
Oh,
what I mean? Like just
yeah.
as it flows out, it takes
Okay.
57 to 60 years apparently for it to completely change every molecule of water in the entire
Neat.
lake.
I like that.
The lake is fascinating to people who come here, and for a reason. I mean, it's a beautiful, huge lake. It also has the bedrock for the lake is actually below sea level, which is crazy as well because we're nowhere near the sea. There's all kinds of really fascinating things with the lake, but the lake being the most important thing for viticulture because the grapes that are closest to the lake have a much more moderated temperature, and so they don't get those heat spikes. They get frost protection. They get all those things that come
Right.
from being right close to the lake. So the best
It's like that water
vineyards,
bottle effect of the Niagara region, right? Same thing.
exactly,
The
exactly the
lake
same
warms
idea.
up the regions and protects it from frost in the winter and then gives it some cooling breezes in the summer. So, yeah.
Exactly, exactly, and I remember seeing that chart, with the airflow patterns and things like that in Niagara. It's the same idea here,
Huh.
except that it's much more compressed. It's a lot smaller, and being closer to the lake is really beneficial. So it's also impossible not to look at when you're driving through here. It's the thing that people notice the most. Just a beautiful, beautiful natural feature.
Huh.
So I think that's maybe not an unobvious response to your question
No, I
because I
like
mean
it though.
obviously the
Some
lake
fun
is
factoids
fantastic.
there. Yeah, yeah. Absolutely. They'll fit in the next dinner party. Anything else
There you
that
go.
you would note about it? About the Okanagan?
Just that the regions are very different, from one place to the next. We tend to see the name Okanagan on everything,
Yeah.
and we just assume that that's the same grapes in Kelowna will be the same as the Soyuz, and they're not. They can be very very different, and they need to grow very very different things. This is
And so
something that I
what
think
would
is
be
interesting.
yeah, absolutely. Very, very different. And so what would be the top red and white grapes? And you can separate them out from north to south if you want, but are they just all the kind of standard cool climate grapes? Riesling, Chardonnay, Pinot, Cab Franc, Gamay?
Yeah, the only real consensus grapes seem to be Chardonnay and Pinot Noir.
Right.
Kelowna, until recently, has really shown a lot of promise with Riesling and Pinot Noir, and so you get wineries like Spearhead or Tantalus or even Summerhill, Cedar Creek. They have extensive Pinot Noir and Riesling plantings that are very, very good. Tantalus, especially, has been on the radar for Jancis Robinson for
Yes.
years because of the age of their vines. But you've also got Martin's Lane, which is a project from Mission Hill that started up that only does Riesling and Pinot Noir, and that's it.
Oh,
That's all they make. Eight versions of each, but still, it's single vineyard things. But so Riesling and Pinot Noir is there now. I say until the last 5 years, the last few winters have been really hard, and especially on Pinot Noir. So we'll see how that kind of changes around Kelowna. As we go
okay.
south, Naramata has Merlot and Pinot Gris, just beautiful examples of each one of those, and they're right up against the lake, so they can do things like Merlot, where they can get a good amount of heat, and they make a kind of the Merlot from there is just got a little bit of a spicy tinge to it, which I love. I think that's just absolutely uniquely Naramata. Okanagan Falls has Pinot Noir and Chardonnay. Chardonnay really starts to shine in Okanagan Falls. In Oliver, then we get down to Cab Franc and more Pinot Gris and Chardonnay as well. And I was a huge, 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 huge fan of Syrah from Osoyoos and Oliver, like in the really southern regions.
Southern.
And that has not fared well in the last few winters, apparently. Syrah in particular has been really, really hard hit. So
Because
I
it
have a
needs a lot of
feeling
warmth to ripen, right? Was it
it
getting too
needs,
much frost?
it has a tendency to die when it gets too cold. And so
Yeah.
they're harvested so late for the most part, apparently. And well, I know they are. They're harvested a little bit later, and the vines just don't have time to shut down and protect themselves properly. And so that's what happened over the last few years, apparently, where it just the vines weren't protected, and they had to be, and then they got subjected to this really lengthy cold snap, and it just bud damage and trunk damage, and it just split the vines and the wood, and Yeah, I've heard a lot of people are replacing their Syrah with Cab Franc or other grape varieties.
Oh,
So
that's too bad.
it is.
Although
It
Cab
is.
Franc is great too. So, um,
Yes.
but what would be kind of your top two travel tips if we want to visit the Okanagan? Now, I know there's all these subregions, but two things we should keep in mind when we go there.
Plan your trip. Plan your trip. Make appointments wherever you can. The difference that I haven't been to Ontario during the high season yet to really know how important appointments are. But in BC, they really are.
Okay.
Just because, especially in the shoulder seasons, because some wineries just aren't big enough to be able to stay open all year round. Ontario's industry is much more 24/7, not 24/7, but full time year round. It's not as seasonal, whereas in BC it's very seasonal. So you can't just sort of walk in to a winery at any time of the year and expect to get a tasting. So that would be one
Good to
thing. The
know.
other thing is you can see the whole valley in a day. I've done it. You can stay in Kelowna and go to Osoyoos and back. But you're going to be missing out on a lot of things. So if you're planning to stay, I would suggest stay in two places.
Okay.
Stay in Kelowna, stay around or West Kelowna for a few days, and then halfway through your stay, or after a week, or however long you're gonna stay, go south. Stay in Osoyoos, or stay in Oliver, stay somewhere else, and it's a very very different thing when you're in the south because there's no lake. The Okanagan Lake ends in Penticton, so the South Okanagan doesn't have a lake, and the climate changes. It's noticeably warmer. It noticeably. I think it's more beautiful because I used to live there. But it's a very that's the tip of the Sonoran Desert that you were talking about before, and you'll really really notice that. To be
Huh.
in Kelowna and never venture south of Penticton, I think is a real shame. So
Yeah.
you're really
Sounds like
missing
it.
out.
Oh, those are great tips. And if you were to highlight three or four must-try wines from the Okanagan, which ones would you be? I know that's hard, like picking children and so on, but just
Yeah,
just do it anyway.
yeah. Boy, wines not to miss. Let me see. I would suggest so if you're in Kelowna,
Hmm.
the wineries not to miss, Tantalus would absolutely be one of them. Just to experience that level of Riesling. The Riesling there is fantastic. Uh, Tantalus would absolutely be on my list. Going south to Naramata, I really suggest everyone go to Naramata. Lake Breeze has probably one of the most Naramata experiences. You're outside. Most of the tastings are always outside. Even before COVID, you could do their tastings outside, which was really interesting. And you've got the lake, you've got the vineyards around you. It's a really cool little environment that they've set up there, and the wines are all fantastic. As you go farther south into Okanagan Falls, Wild Goose, I think, is really, really interesting in terms of the style. It's a very German style of winery, but what they do really, really amazingly well. And then in the south, boy, if I had to, Burrowing Owl probably would be the
Oh, yeah.
one. It'll give you the best sense of what it is to be in the South Okanagan amongst a huge, vineyard land, like huge plot of vineyards, and with a beautiful view and screaming good wines.
And they have a great restaurant, and I don't know, I
They
think they have a
do.
place to stay there too, an
They
inn or
do.
something. Yeah,
Yeah,
which is nice.
absolutely.
And one more that I should mention, I don't know if there's been any changes or updates with the wildfires, but when I went, I stayed in Osoyoos at, I always have a hard time pronouncing it, Inkameep,
Yeah, that's
the
right. You got it.
indigenous owned winery. And there's also a gorgeous restaurant and hotel. And then they have a history museum. It's fabulous. Is that still all operating?
Yeah, and it's fantastic too. That's
Okay.
Spirit Ridge as well. That's the
Okay.
resort that's right there. But Incomeep is there. You pronounced it absolutely properly too. That's
Oh,
really
great.
good. Yeah, a lot of people just get that wrong. But they have that visitor center. It's a fantastic place to stay,
It
and
is.
that's the real desert experience. They have that desert cultural center there.
And the wines are fantastic.
They are. I actually went there. I didn't know it was their first season, but I went there before in 2003. It was their very first spring that they were opened,
Wow.
and they had the winery. And Spirit Ridge wasn't there. It was just a field of bunch grass and black sage and rocks. and it was it was really cool. I have pictures of there from that time of the winery, and then nothing around it, and now it's like all kinds of built up and everything. It's really quite
Yeah,
cool.
and I love that it is Indigenous owned and operated, and the chief winemaker, Randy, what's
Randy
his last
Picton,
name? Pifton
yeah,
is Indigenous himself, part of the band.
that's correct. Yeah.
So it's a
Now
great story.
Randy retired recently, but
Oh, did he?
he's
Okay.
yeah he's passed it off, and I didn't know this until like just recently actually. But he'd retired because I always assume I've been to winemakers dinners there for years, and it's I know Randy, and uh, and he's passed it off, and I can never remember his. I think it's Aaron who's taken over now, but his cellar hand who he'd trained for like 8, 10 years or something like that. So there's going to be some great consistency there, and
Good transition. Yeah.
yeah, they've done a really good job, and that in itself, as any winery will tell you, is a difficult thing to do. So they did
Absolutely, because
a
you
really
get
good
one
job.
chance each year. It's not like beer where you're making batches all year. It's like,
That's
let's
right.
learn once a year. Whoa, did we do it right or not?
Yeah.
So, as I mentioned, there's 11 sub-appellations in the Okanagan Valley. I'll just rhyme them off now for those who are curious. The East Kelowna Slopes, the Golden Mile Bench, the Golden Miles Slopes, Lake Country Okanagan Falls, where you are, Luke, Naramata Bench, Shaha Bench,
Skaha.
Staha, okay.
Yeah.
South Kelowna Slopes, Summerland Bench, Summerland Lakefront, and Summerland Valleys. Why do we often hear, you've already brought it up, so much about the Golden Mile? What's so special about it?
Well, the Golden Mile Bench was the first one. First of all, 2015 was their very first year that they were allowed to use the Golden Mile Bench, and it was certified. It took 6 years or something for them to get to that far, and so it kind of established the precedent for it from a business side of it. For the wine, though, what's interesting is that it is the vineyards are east facing, so they
Okay.
get the morning sunlight, but they lose the sunlight earlier in the day because of the mountain behind them. And what that does is it helps preserve the acidity in the wine. So while the other side of the valley gets kind of baked long into the evening, the Golden Mile Bench wines retain their acidity, and they're much more, I find, much more structured than
Uh-huh.
wines that are more consistently structured. And and so they get this morning sun. They lose it in the afternoon. They're also very high slopes. There's no wind fans. Sometimes you see these wind fans in the middle of the vineyards to protect it against frost. They don't
Okay.
need that there because the cold air doesn't have a place to pool, and so they're protected from frost. So their season is longer. I actually did a video on YouTube once where this was at the beginning of November. We still had green leaves on the vines on the Golden Mile, and I kept the camera rolling, and I drove down the hill, and the vines at the bottom of the hill were like had lost their leaves, weeks ago. And
Wow, that's
so
dramatic.
yeah, and it's super easy, and it was really like a kilometer away. That's the only difference. But there was also a difference in elevation as well too. So the Golden Mile Bench is a very, very, very special place, and some of the best
Yeah.
vineyard land, I would argue, in the country is there.
I love that mountain shadow, sort of that protection in the afternoon. So, what would be a couple of wineries that you would highlight from the Golden Mile that we should try?
Oh, basically, Kalmina is up there.
Okay.
Kalmina and then Checkmate are on the same sort of southeast facing, or southeast facing ridges. And then Geringer Brothers as well is also, those two plots of land, I believe, are the two best vineyard sites in BC for sure, if not the country, because
Wow.
of their southeastern facing and things like that. There are other vineyards there. Hester Creek is there. Row 13 is there. They're on sort of northeastern facing, so they're sloped away from the south a little bit, but they're
Okay.
still very, very good properties. And then Fairview Cellars, which is right at the top, the northernmost part of it, faces southeast
Yeah.
as well, and just gorgeous reds. I mean, reds that you just don't think come from BC. They come from Fairview Cellars. They're just fantastic.
Wow. And Checkmate, that's another Mission Hill property, right?
That's correct. Yeah, they
Okay.
focus on Chardonnay and Merlot.
Okay.
And that's their thing. Chardonnay, you might have you might have read in my history book that Mission Hill won a very large award for their 1992 Grand Reserve Chardonnay in 1994, when most Canadian wineries were really only winning wines for ice wine and things like that. Inniskillen had
Right.
won their big Prix d'Honneur and stuff like that. But nobody had won anything for dry wine, and so Mission Hill wins this from from Chardonnay. The Chardonnay came from a vineyard called the De Clava Vineyard, which is on the Golden Mile. They purchased that vineyard years later, and it's right next door to where Checkmate is now. So they have a long history with that vineyard, and they're making some absolutely stunning Chardonnays there.
And a side note, Mission Hill is worth dropping into. It's architecturally beautiful. I think it's Spanish themed. And then they have this restaurant that is, you sit and you look the terrace right overlooking the Okanagan Valley outdoors. It's beautiful. But interestingly, Anthony Von Mendel, who owns Mission Hill, is he the founder of both Mike's Hard Lemonade and White Claw?
Yeah, those are part of his portfolio at some point. Mike's Hard Lemonade was in the 90s, and I went to university in the 90s, so I
familiar.
distinctly remember Mike's Hard Lemonade at that time. And I remember the first time I went there, I looked up at the bell tower, and I'm like, oh God, my university career must have paid for at least, part of that bell somehow.
Exactly. So major cash to invest in all his properties, from these ready to drink drinks in cans. So probably likes to keep those brands separate, but what the heck? I find it fascinating that's the backstory there.
It is, and that should be part of the winery's story in that way, and it is. They don't hide that fact, but that has to be part of it as well too, because I think that has something to do absolutely with the success of the winery, and why not?
It takes serious investment. The old joke is, how do you make $1 million in the wine industry? Start with 10 million, So, and he obviously did. One more I wanted to hit on before we leave the Okanagan, Quails Gate. Where exactly is that on your regional map?
It's in West Kelowna. It's actually sort of down the road and across the street from Mission Hill. I was obsessed with that property for a number of years because they have a long history. That there's a cabin on that property that used to be their wine shop, but that was built in the 19th century. It was a pioneer's cabin. It was built by the McDougall family. I knew that, and he's the guy who built it. But it was actually John Fall Allison, who was a rancher in Princeton. He had a summer ranch in West Kelowna, and he called it Sunnyside. And that is the history of that property. And now it's a vineyard. It's been a vineyard since the 50s or 60s when the Stewart family, purchased it. But it's just a beautiful, beautiful place. They have a wonderful restaurant there. They have a wonderful tasting room. They've just done such a good job with that place, and I love going there.
And spectacular wines that we actually do get in Ontario. So
yes, that's
kind
true.
of a bonus.
Yes, you would.
Yeah. All right. So, oh my goodness, I'm got to get through more of this quickly here. So your Sipster guide features the best 50 wines to try. Now, I don't know if you did this in both the BC Sipster guide to the 50 best wines to try in both BC and Ontario, but you also have mood pairings. Did you do that again in the Ontario guide?
Yeah, I did, and there's a few. The differences between these books really there aren't a lot of differences between these two, other than they're obviously 50 different wines, but I try to match wines with food because I think that gives people options. And I used to teach a class on wine and food pairing, but there's more to just wine pairing than food, because if you have the wrong wine at the wrong time, you either won't like the wine or it will taste better than you think it, or worse than you think it, than you probably would have otherwise. I get a lot of people or I used to when I worked in wine shops, they're like, yeah, when I got home, the wine didn't taste the same somehow.
Right.
And it's like, well, why was that? Well, I was alone and I was just having dinner and I had spaghetti with it and it wasn't really a good experience. But I said, well, when you were here, you were with friends, you were having a good time. This was probably the third winery you've been to that day. Like the mood is very different. And so if the mood changes, then your perception of the wine can change too. And so with Sipsters, if you have a chatty wine, like a wine that has really complex and lots of things to say, if you're in
wine, I love that.
Yeah, like if you're in a reception where everyone else is chatting too, you're probably not going to be able to pay attention to the conversation as well. So when you're at a reception, a really simple wine is probably the best thing, and you'll probably appreciate it more.
Sure.
Whereas if you're having dinner alone or with your, just together with your partner, and you don't need as much of a conversation, a time when it's comfortable to be quiet, a chatty wine might be perfect, because then you'll be able to hear what it's saying. And so those are the kind of, that's just sort of one example of wine and mood pairing, but I think it helps influence how people like wines.
And now you called, or maybe several wines, lustful. So what is a lustful wine, and what would be one specifically that you've described as lustful?
It's a wine that you would it's a wine that picked you up at the bar, not that you picked up at the bar, right? That's
great.
The kind of wine.
Oh, I like that.
It's
hey,
the wine.
Come here often. I'll be here all week. Is that my wine?
Oh, that's a nice corkscrew you got there. No, but basically.
Keep it clean.
So, I know. So it's wine that loves you back, basically. It's one thing to be able to say, yes, I love this wine, and this wine is speaking to me, or this wine is real. Oh, I want to get to know this wine. But there's sometimes the wine is like, you can tell the wine likes you, and you want it to be. You're just appreciating the attention that this wine is giving you, and it's not all wines do that. Every wine has a bit of an attitude, and this is the thing. Yeah. It's and it all comes from, but all these books, all the Sipster's books, come from how I used to talk about wine to customers when I worked at a wine store. And I got really bored with the fact that people would ask about a wine, and I'd say, well, it tastes like strawberries and rhubarb, and it's lovely with this and that and the other, and I just do the tasting note thing. And I thought at some point, well, how boring is that? And customers didn't respond to it. Whereas when I went to when a customer held up two bottles and said, what's the difference between these two? And I said, well, that one's a Honda Civic and that one's a Ferrari. And they're like, okay. And
it's probably more relatable. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And it didn't say anything about the wine, but what it did was it said the experience. And I think customers really want to know about the experience rather than technical details. As wine writers and people in the industry, we get really caught up with the technical part of it, because for us that's actually really interesting, and it is very interesting, and some people, enthusiasts, really kind of like that. But I think most people, like the general public, who don't know what those stats mean and don't know what RS and TA and that kind of thing
residual
means.
Sugar, volatile acidity.
Yeah, titratable acidity and things like that. Like, where we don't know about that kind of stuff, it's meaningless. And so,
Sure.
Whereas if I say that this wine is named after an angel, then they'll probably,
there's a story.
There's a story.
Yeah, back to stories
again. They can
again.
relate to it. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Well, and I think too, there's a point, and we don't give it enough credit. You talk about a lustful wine, but our body chemistries are all different. So the wine is going to react with you differently from somebody else. And, they're coming out with all sorts of studies now that say the type of music that you're playing can affect your taste of the wine, whether you like it or not, or how much of it you're getting. So I think, we've got all these cross-modal, sensory things going on when we taste wine, and we're all different. So I think, it's not just a playful, more accessible way to talk about wine. I think there are actually things going on that make a wine more lustful to one person versus another. So, yeah.
And I think it's a bigger. That's a bigger conversation than the scope of these books. But I just tried to sort of match it, at least with attitude and everything like that, just to kind of open up the conversation a little bit. But there's far more to explore than that. Absolutely, yeah. It's really cool.
Yeah. All right, let's talk about two more sub-appellations in the Okanagan, since it still is the biggest in BC. Vancouver Island, we'll just compress this a little bit, but Vancouver Island has one sub-appellation, the Cowichan Valley. Vancouver Island, of course, is where Victoria, the city, is. Yep. So how is that different? Of course, it's going to be different being an island, but what really strikes you as the differences there versus the Okanagan, and why do you describe it as the Italy of BC?
Yeah, I have done that, haven't I? I still think that. I still think it's the Italy of BC. It's the food that it goes with. Those wines just wrap themselves around the food. that you're eating, and they just give it a hug. It is a really, really food friendly kind of wine style.
Is that because of the acidity?
Yeah, the acidity is a little higher, which for me took some getting used to when I first went there, but it's really changed now, and especially in the Cowichan. And I'm glad they separated out the Cowichan Valley because it is very different there than it is in other places. It'll be, raining and miserable in Victoria, and then you drive up the Malahat and come into Duncan, and it's beautiful, and it feels like the Okanagan in spots.
I got married in the Malahat at the Airy, the resort at the
Oh,
top of the mountain overlooking
yeah.
the Finlayson Arm, I think it is. Something
Yeah.
like
Oh,
that.
that's
Yeah.
cool. Oh, what a
Yeah.
beautiful place to get married. Yeah.
It
That's
was,
cool.
yeah. I'm divorced now, but the
Well,
region
yeah.
remains in my heart. Just the
That's-
region. Anyway, side note.
Like,
But
It's
what
it's
couple
beautiful.
wineries
Yeah.
would you highlight there? Like, what are a couple of labels we should look for from Vancouver
Oh,
Island?
absolutely. Blue Grouse. Blue Grouse is
Okay.
one of them. Bailey Williamson is the winemaker there, and Pinot Noir. Just beautiful portfolio of wines, and it's a beautiful place to visit too, which is spectacular. They're one of them, absolutely for sure. And then Emendar Wines, which is kind of a weird name, but it's literally a transliteration of M and R, which is Mike and Robin Narichlo. And they've
Okay.
been there for about 10 years. They're very small. They're just outside of Duncan, and just crazy, amazing Pinot Noir. And they do Fauche, and it's good. And they do Sauvignon Blanc, which is lovely, and it's quite fantastic. And then Alderley, which is actually just past them as well. Alderley has some gorgeous Pinot Noir that's going to be, or may not be, appearing in a future Okanagan, BC Sipster's book at some point. No
Book,
spoilers.
okay. All right. And let's zoom over to the Similkameen Valley. Where is it in relation to the Okanagan and Vancouver Island, and what makes it different?
So the Similkameen is right next to the Okanagan Valley, and to
Okay.
the southern portion of the Okanagan Valley. And the Similkameen it follows the Okanagan, and then it kind of turns west from there. So it's a bit of an odd-shaped valley. It's deep valley, and it's very narrow. And what makes it fantastically interesting is that the soils haven't been the Okanagan was a bit of a meltwater channel, so the soils got kind of jumbled, whereas the Similkameen didn't. And so there's very beautiful plateaus and benchlands there that have really good, is perfect for grapevines. So they have there's no lake there, so it can be a little bit picky in the spring and the summer, or spring and the fall, but it's just a gorgeous, gorgeous place for growing grapes. And there's a really distinct kind of minerality to the red wines that I get, and I like to think anyways that I can pick out red wines from the Similkameen very quickly because of that. It's like a signature of the red wines from the Similkameen, and I don't know what it is. It's like a bricky, dusty kind of silty aroma to it, which is fantastically interesting, and just deep and savory reds in the Similkameen. Love
That
them.
sounds, oh, my mouth's
Yeah.
watering. So pick out a couple of wineries that you would highlight from that region.
Oh, Courcelette, which is Charlie and Jesse Basler. They are sort of in a unique spot that looks south. So they have a south-facing vineyard. They make all kinds of amazing things, beautiful Syrahs, wonderful Pinot Noirs. Clos de Soleil is right next to them. They do sort of like a meritage styles of wine, lots of blends, so like a Bordeaux style red and a white. There's Hugging Tree, which is down the street. They have a wonderful Viognier and a Merlot that you really have to try. And then Seven Stones, which is farther down, it's farther south. But super savory Pinot Noirs. And if you want to try, if you would had to try one Cabernet Franc, 'cause I know you like Cabernet Franc, but if you want Cabernet Franc from the Similkameen, it's Seven Stones.
Seven Stones. Okay, got it. All right, and let's just do a few quick hits on the rest of them because I do want to just mention them. Maybe give us one or two things that stand out about the Fraser Valley.
Fraser Valley is very interesting. It's much more moderate climate than other places, and that's what makes it gives it slightly, not maybe a longer growing season, but it's the potential for a longer growing season. It is a little bit more wet there, though, so it's not quite as easy to visit sometimes. But it's a beautiful place, and Mount Lehman area of Abbotsford is actually coming up as a very, very spectacular place to visit.
And where is it in
wine.
relation to the Okanagan?
Oh, it's closer to the coast, so it's about an hour east
Coast.
of Vancouver.
Okay. Okay.
So about
okay,
3
cool.
hours from the Okanagan.
All right. The Gulf Islands?
Gulf Islands, I haven't. I've been to a few of them. I've been to Salt Spring Island,
I went there on my
and
honeymoon. Again, love
yeah,
the island
see,
still.
love the
Yeah.
oh, you should make some new memories in these places, I think.
Yeah,
But
I should.
there's some Salt Spring Island is beautiful. I was there last summer, and they've had some really interesting vineyards there. It's a little trickier on the Gulf Islands because you can't go and visit them very quickly. You can really only visit one or two at a time because just
Sure.
the day trips and the ferries and stuff like that. But there's some really interesting. Sea Star was actually in my first Sipster's guide, and they're on. I can't remember now which island they're on. There's so many of them, but yeah, they're really interesting stuff, especially around with aromatic grape varieties, Ortega, and they actually have Pinot Noir there as well too. So really interesting stuff. It's
Very
an
cool.
adventure.
Great
That's
restaurants,
the
yeah.
most adventurous places to go is the Gulf Islands.
And they're so beautiful. Just lots of organic stuff going on with food and restaurants.
Oh yeah,
Do you pronounce it the Kootenays?
yeah, Kootenay, yeah,
Kootenay.
the
Okay.
Kootenay region. Yeah,
Where is
that's
that?
so that's east of the Okanagan Valley. So
Okay.
it's a couple hours drive, at least a couple hours, if not more. Well, yeah, probably about 3 or 4 hours drive actually. There's a wonderful winery in the cusp called Valley of the Springs. I visited there. They're the only. They were at the time the only winery in the cusp, and that's a little bit farther north. It's kind of due east of Kelowna or Vernon, I think maybe, and just gorgeous area. It feels like you're sort of in lumberjack territory, and you are. But it's just wonderful aromatic whites and beautiful, very juicy, not highly tannic reds, and it's fantastically interesting. And then Creston is another town that's about 3 hours from there. Kootenay is a large region geographically, and there's nothing that really unifies it all, other than it's part of the Kootenay Lake or it's surrounding Kootenay Lake. But Creston has some beautiful Pinot Noir from a winery called Bailey Groman, which is there. And there's some other ones that are just, yeah, killing it with Pinot Noir.
Oh, that's great. Ah, Lillooet?
Lillooet,
Lillooet.
yes.
Okay.
Lillooet
Wh-
is Fort Barons. They were actually in volume 2 of my BC Sipsters guide.
Okay.
They have wonderful Cab Franc and just screaming Riesling. I mean, the Riesling is just beautiful. It's not like an international style. It's kind of a unique, its own version style, which I really like. And so there'll be some really interesting stuff coming from Fort Barons.
And where is it in relation to the Okanagan?
So it's about halfway between the Okanagan and the coast. So between Whistler and say Kamloops, it's about
Okay.
halfway in between there. It's really literally in the middle of nowhere. And there's really no reason to go there unless you're driving sort of nearby it. The Trans-Canada Highway kind of goes a couple of valleys to the east of it.
So order directly from the winery and they'll ship.
Yeah.
Most of these wineries do ship to your door across
Absolutely.
Canada, I should say.
Yes.
Yeah, even though interprovincial borders are nuts. But anyway.
That's
And
another
then,
podcast, though.
yes, that is. How do you say it? Shuswap?
Shuswap.
Shuswap. Okay.
Yeah, Shuswap.
Where
Yeah,
is that?
that's north of the Okanagan, so that's directly north. Shuswap Lake is geologically long years, millions of years ago. The Okanagan flowed north. It flows south now, but it used to flow north into what is now Shuswap Lake, and then it would go down. The water would go through Kamloops and then down through the Fraser River system, but it doesn't now. But it still looks like it's kind of the same valley, and it is when you drive up, except the waters don't connect. So Shuswap is a large, deep lake, and it kind of moderates everything around there. And so there's a few vineyards that are up in that area around towns like Tappan. There's a winery called Recline Ridge, which is interesting. There's another one called Larch Hills, which is nowhere near the lake, but it's high up and it's south-facing, and it's just a most beautiful view. It's really cool. It makes you feel like you're in Switzerland when you're there.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
And then finally, the Thompson Valley.
Thompson Valley, that's around Kamloops, and I haven't actually explored there as much. Monty Creek is up there, and I've driven in that area a few times. What's fun about Thompson is that it looks a little bit like the Okanagan in that way. It's got that same kind of desert vibe to it, but it has a shorter growing season, and the soils are slightly different there. So the wines that you get from it are going to be a little bit different. But because their season is compressed a little bit more, they're experimenting with a lot of grapes that are the more recent hybrid grapes. So Frontenac and Céval Blanc is not a hybrid, but Frontenac Blanc and Frontenac Gris is grown there, and they have a whole bunch of other different hybrid varieties. They're making some really, really interesting wines out of it. So I'm really excited. There's a lot of potential there.
Awesome. Wow. Great roundup. Well done. So if you look at BC, and I'll ask the same question about Ontario, because we need to continue this conversation about Ontario, but what does BC need to start doing that it's not doing now as a wine region in order to thrive for the next 5 to 10 years?
Oh boy. In my opinion, BC needs to kind of hone its varieties down. The thing that I noticed the first time I was in Ontario was that most every winery has a Pinot Noir, they have a Gamay, and they have a Sauvignon Blanc, and then they have some other stuff. But for the most part, there's a little bit more consensus there about what does well. And then when I taste the Pinot Noirs and I taste the Sauvignon Blancs, I'm tasting like much more profound depth to them than anything I've tasted in BC from those varieties. So I think BC needs to kind of hone itself, and I think the weather patterns that happened over the last few years are going to encourage that. I think there's going to be a little bit more. It's not going to be Syrah growing next to Pinot Noir, growing next to Riesling, growing next to Cabernet Sauvignon, which is what happens here now. I think that's going to change, and I think that'll eventually we'll start to see some more consensus about that.
And similarly for Ontario, what does it need to start doing that it's not doing now to thrive in the future?
It needs to be let out of its pen. It needs to be let out of Ontario. Like we need to be able to get these wines in other parts of the country, and I think when that happens, I think we'll start to see a much more gracious wine drinking public in Canada throughout the country, and there'll be more of a wine culture. But right now, it seems to be Ontario's sequestered in Ontario, and there's a big enough market for it. So clearly, they're not hurting for that. But it would be really nice to get more Ontario wines,
especially for those small craft producers who don't have enough volume to fill big chains like the LCBO, even in the BC liquor stores or SAQ. So they really do need to be able to ship directly to a customer list to thrive.
Exactly.
So for back to BC, what does it need to stop doing that it's doing now in order to thrive in the future?
What does it need to stop doing?
Oh, maybe that's just how you answered the first question.
Yeah,
it needs to narrow down so many varietals. Yeah.
Yeah.
Or so many grapes, I should say.
A little bit.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
because otherwise, I think business practice wise, it's marketing. It's got marketing down pretty well. Ontario wines, are getting better at marketing. Although I did notice that a lot of wineries that I contacted in Ontario, when I sent them an email, they replied with a phone call, and so I'm like, maybe just email, So there's some sort of maybe updating that needs to happen in some ways, but no, I think there's a lot of potential in both regions, and I think there's some really interesting strengths in both regions that I think that each can learn from. And I think I think we just need the opportunity to be able to learn from it. We can't be sequestered so much between the two sides. Like, yes, it's far away. We are farther away from each other, but we're not that far.
It's the same country, so hey, they built the railroad, so there's always a possibility of getting that stuff elsewhere.
Yeah.
So how we've been in and out of the Sipster's Guide, both for BC and the latest one is Ontario. Both make great gifts. How are they similar or different to, say, a Hugh Johnson pocket guide?
Yeah, so I have a number of those pocket guides, which are fantastic. Those are a lot of industry stats, and it's really densely packed with information in those guides. This is very much not meant to replace that. This is very much it's trying to make wine reading fun, and not. I mean, reading a Hugh Johnson book is fun for me. I enjoy that, but I think that would make a lot of customers and just sort of regular wine people kind of melt down with all the information. And so what this is more, these are more conversational. These are more, I learned a term. I went to a writers' festival about a month ago, and I learned a term called flash fiction. And
Ah,
someone pointed out that that's sort of what I do, and it is a little bit in that way.
that's cool.
But I'm using wine as the thing. I've sold these books to people who don't even drink wine because they're like, well, this is just fun to read.
That's
And
great.
yeah,
That's a
which I thought
compliment.
was
The
really
stories
interesting.
and the colorful anecdotes. But back to your
Yeah.
flash fiction. What was it? 50 Shades of Grey was flash fiction for, I think, the vampire series. So it's when someone riffs off an original work but does a completely different new creative thing with it. So you've got your Hugh Johnson, and then you're doing something completely new and different with these
Oh,
guides.
yeah, I think you're thinking of fan fiction.
Oh, fan fiction. Okay,
Yeah.
so yeah, we're not
No,
going to get 50 Shades of Grey in your books. Oh.
Well, I don't know. The corkscrew comment before was
Well,
got
yeah,
a
the
little
whole
bit close, I
lustful
guess.
wine. It was getting a bit off color there. Yeah, no, just
Yeah,
kidding.
no. The flash fiction is as it was told to me, and I haven't sort of researched this or anything, but as someone told me that I did sort of what is flash fiction. Flash fiction is like having a narrative, but using only like 300 words to do a whole complete, full story spun out narrative, but in a
Right.
very, very, very
Condensed.
concise. Yes.
Oh, it's like those tiny love stories in the New York Times. So they got modern love, big column, and
Yeah.
then they've got 100 words, tiny love stories, which I love. Which cool.
I've never read those, but I want to now. That sounds
It's
really
in the
good.
styles or the lifestyle section. It's where I go to first. That's where my
Nice.
mind is in the Times.
Right
Anyway,
on.
yeah.
Well, but
No,
that's so
cool.
that's sort of what it is. It's little. I mean, I can show you some pages. I mean, it's really just here's 16-mile cellar. So basically, it's a picture of the wine and then a very quick write up that's basically using the wine as a starting point. And what I want to do is explain, give a story that explains my feeling of basically the sense that I get from the wine, and kind of spin a bit of a story around that. And
That's so
some
cool.
of them come from, the first book was me and my ex-girlfriend having dinner, every night, and the wine would just sort of speak to me or it didn't. And when it spoke to me, then I actually got out my laptop during dinner, which I know now is probably pretty rude, but I started I
You
started
did say
writing.
she's an ex-girlfriend.
And she, well, I could have been part of it, but basically it was, I just had to kind of get just the main point out of something that I wanted to say, and then I put the laptop away, and then I
Then
went
she's
back to it
staring at you.
later,
Yeah,
and
good,
and spun it out and sort of worked it out and into
Cool.
something that was entertaining to read.
That is great. And has anybody said anything about either of the Sipster's guides that has stuck out for you? Like something interesting someone said about either book?
Just that they were very, very well. I mean, people buy like 3 or 4 of them at a time. First of all, because they think, well, I know people who like this, and then
Yeah, and they're easy to give out.
Actually, absolutely, and they're only $20, so that also helps too. I've had some comments that like John was quite appreciative of it. John Schreiner, where he said that it was just a very entertaining new way to write about wine,
That's
and
great.
it is, and that was the goal. It was supposed to be very, very entertaining, really.
Cool. Cool. Sounds like you accomplished it.
I hope
And
so.
3 people listening to this podcast or the video are going to win copies of your new book, which is fabulous. So thank you for offering that.
Yeah, and I thought of, instead of just if it's someone from Ontario who wins it, I'll send the
Yeah.
Ontario book. But if it's someone from BC, I'll offer volume 2. So
Oh, that's
we can
great.
you can't do 3 of each, but 3
No, that's
winners
fine. Yeah,
total.
that's
And
very
if they
that's
happen to
very
be from
flexible and
BC,
generous. Yeah. Okay. Well, I will connect you with them via email,
okay.
and so that you guys can work it out which book. But that is wonderful. So I know that you have a flight to catch. Is there anything that we haven't covered that you wanted to mention now before I ask where we can find you online and your books online?
Yeah, well, I mean, you can go to my website, sipsterswinepodcast.ca or sipsters.ca. You can connect with me there. I do have Instagram. I don't use it very much. I'm sort of on the fence about social media at the moment. But I also now have a Substack, which you can get to, where it's more the more industry oriented writing, but also if you want to learn about wineries that are the top drawer. The wineries that I feature in here are all, I restrict myself to wines that are under $50
Oh,
and that are
okay.
consistently
Good to know.
available. So everything in these books are absolutely accessible to everybody, which is, I think, really important to
Okay.
me. But
Yes.
Sipster's Icons is my way of kind of, because when I'm talking to wineries, they show me all these really amazing wines that I cannot write about in these books. And so what I want to do is use that as a platform to write about those fantastic wines that are just
So they're the more
amazing.
expensive, harder to get, but still, I would say they're
Yeah.
probably you can still buy them maybe from the winery if they're not all on allocation and previously
Oh,
sold out.
absolutely. Yeah, no, I
Yeah.
don't write about things that are just impossible to get. I think that's kind of that's difficult. But what I wanted to do was write about wines that I thought were that I just wasn't able to include in the book, and they don't even
Mm-hmm.
have to be expensive. Some of them are just we made this one wine once, and
Okay.
there's some wineries that are really very natural, like the Revel cider actually from Ontario. They make all kinds of very small batch ciders, but they're very, very unique, each one of them. And so they don't necessarily, it was hard to kind of choose one to include because I don't know when, by the time the book comes out, if they're still going to be able to produce that wine.
Sure.
So I
Sure.
can write about that with
Understandable.
Sipster's Icons. Yeah.
Awesome. And where can we find the books?
Books are available online at all the major retailers. I don't know about small bookstores in Toronto, but I always sort of recommend that.
Mm-hmm.
Mosaic Books in Kelowna has the BC Sipsters, both of them, the Sipsters books, Volume 1 and Volume 2. Volume 3 for BC is going to be coming out in the spring,
Oh,
and I'm just
congratulations.
starting writing Volume 2 for Ontario.
Wow. So
So
it's a whole
it's a
franchise you got going there.
part-time
So
job now, yeah.
that's great. That's great, Luke.
It's fun,
All
yeah.
right. So we'll put all the links to your website, your Substack, where you can find the books in the show notes. But Luke, I want to say thank you so much for this, your wealth of information on both provinces. So really appreciate your time and sharing all those stories and experiences with us.
Oh, thank you so much for having me, Natalie. This is great.
All right. Cheers. I'll say
Cheers.
goodbye for now, but don't hang up yet.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you.